Hello, everybody. Welcome to the February 28th, 2023 occurrence of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so please be respectful and nice to everybody, not just in this meeting, but in general, because being nice to people is a good thing to do. As a reminder, we have an open agenda. I'll post the agenda and meeting notes link here in the chat. And then I'm going to share my screen so that we can all look at said agenda as we go throughout the meeting. Please, if you're here, make sure to add your name and organization to the attendees list. This helps us keep track and evaluate if these split times are working great for folks, or if we need to make any adjustments to our cadence or schedule to make sure we're accommodating people. Also, if you have a topic you'd like to discuss, the agenda is open. So just pop a topic here down in the meeting notes section. To start off with, we're going to go through a recap as has become our custom. So during our last meeting, we had spent a good bit of time listening and discussing feedback from Linkerd's experience adopting Gateway API, both, I believe, with both feedback of the ingress and the mesh use cases. And
pretty much that was pretty much the mesh use case. Wow, I can't say that. Yeah, just for the record.
Okay, yeah, so mostly mesh use case. Wow, that's difficult to say. You got me thinking about it. I'm overthinking in my head now. Yeah, so that was okay. So thanks for the clarification. That was the mesh use cases that we discussed last time. All things considered, I think the takeaway there was that there's going to be some work necessary to make sure consumer routes is going to be feasible for Linkerd, but all in all, hoping it looking positive as far as Linkerd's adoption with our draft spec that we hope to release in 070. We also had a great discussion that was kicked off by Sanjeev about multi-cluster network service networking and the various mesh not issues, but the problem space for mesh within multi-cluster. Kind of desiring a somewhat standard approach to Kubernetes for multi-cluster service networking. He linked a PowerPoint. If nobody else does afterward, I'll go through and add the link back here in the recap to that slide deck with great content and diagrams digging into the approach and the ask. One of my takeaways there, I had a chance to talk to Sanjeev asynchronously in Slack along with Rob, and again, a lot of great points that were raised. And I think the takeaway for me is that there's still a lot of work to do, potentially a lot of use cases in SYNC multi-cluster and the MCS API that aren't as smooth with users as we'd like them to be. I think for me, the best place to start those conversations will be in SYNC multi-cluster. And yet, while that is yet another community meeting to add to everybody's agenda, I know I'm just trying to start attending those more frequently and share some feedback that I've gotten from some of my users and my customers as far as how MCS API and other things from SYNC multi-cluster are working. And then maybe we can get SYNC network, SYNC multi-cluster, Gamma, Gateway together at some point and address some of these things in a kind of an iterative approach. So thanks to whoever looked at that presentation. It's there in the recap. And yeah, that might be a good thing to do some Slack discussion on, or GitHub discussions asynchronously to capture thoughts there.
Let me guess, the multi-cluster meeting is at 7 p.m. Eastern every Monday, right?
No, it's actually, yeah, I think it's actually near the same time slot, bi-weekly on Tuesdays.
Well, maybe that'll even be possible then.
I'll link those SYNC multi-cluster meeting notes on our doc.
Flynn had his salt ready.
Yeah, for the record, it's 9:30 a.m. Pacific on Tuesdays. Also bi-weekly. I think it's not this week, so next week. But don't quote me on that. Yeah, it's next week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Have to see what I can do.
All right. Last call for questions or comments on our recap. All right, fantastic. Then let's get into our agenda. So first we've got Mike Beaumont seeking feedback on the Gamma conformance testing plan that was put together. I'm really excited about this because this helps get us closer to our 070 milestone. Mike, are you here and able to speak on this?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a draft of the testing plan, and I guess there's not much to say about it here, but I would love any feedback on what's missing, perhaps. And I'm not sure if I'm not exactly sure what kind of testing plan is, like what a testing plan is in terms of what we need for the release. So any feedback on that would be great. I mean, we know what it has to have in it. So yeah, please.
Yeah, I left one comment on there. The thing that
Good
I think,
comment.
I think, yeah, thank you. I think it's a really useful plan to have it out there. I think the thing that I'm most interested in is what we're going to do differently from our existing conformance tests, because it seems like we'll have at least some modifications, like the request will likely have to originate from within the cluster, from different namespaces, how we'll do that roughly.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I'd really like what you already have there.
I think what's there
Yeah.
looks really good for the record.
Yeah,
Rob, I think eventually we would. Yeah, that's kind of weird. We might actually need to do some coming from outside the cluster as well as from inside the cluster eventually. But
Yeah.
yuck. I was going to ask a question. I'm not really sure how to meaningfully phrase this one. I need to go look at how conformance tests run in more detail right now. But does this turn out to be a different mode that we run the conformance tests? Is it a different set of tests entirely within the Gateway API repo? Any thoughts there from anybody?
That's a good question. I think we'll want to run some of the conformance tests for mesh implementations as well, right? Like stuff like filters. They should behave the same way, right? But there definitely will need to be some modifications to the framework to allow like requests to be sent from inside a mesh. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll chime in here a bit because I was starting some work on conformance tests. Got sidetracked for a little bit, and basically it was kind of I can't remember when we did this. It was a couple months ago. But we decided that for the actual how of essentially doing requests within the cluster, we're going to try to leverage some of Istio's conformance test framework. I started a spike of trying to get those two integrated. Istio's conformance test framework is, what's the best way to phrase this? It's extremely robust. It can do a lot of things, and it has a lot of abstractions for doing a lot of these things. Those abstractions didn't necessarily it wasn't a super easy lift and shift of the testing framework. And I, after like copy pasting like 10 packages, I said, okay, let's take a step back. Because I really don't want to try to bloat the Gateway API repo test framework. So I'm taking a second pass at it and trying to create some the appropriate abstractions on the Gateway API side and just get a basic like kubectl exec implementation in, and then try to use the Istio Echo server in the second go round. But yeah, I put that down for a couple of weeks because of some other things that came up. Hopefully gonna have some time later this week to pick that back up. So that there's at least one option that we discussed about as far as to how we do the in-cluster networking piece. Any other questions or comments here? All right, sounds like the action item here then is for folks to take a look at Mike, which do you?
Mike is good.
Okay, on Mike's conformance testing doc. I think once we get that in good shape, we'll be able to close the associated issue and move forward in our milestone planning, which that reminds me, I'll add a topic for our next meeting to check out our milestone, because it's been a couple of weeks. We want to try to get those closed. All right, next topic, Flynn, want to give us a status update working through gateway and mesh interactions with Mike Morris?
Oh, I get it. This is why he changed that to only Flynn instead of Flynn and Mike. Now I understand. Yeah, Mike and I got together yesterday, talked a bit about some of this stuff. I agree that I'm hopeful that we will have a draft that we can meaningfully share next week. I don't think that's going to be too heavy a lift for that. I think that one of the big things that we started running immediately into is, maybe we could summarize it as thoughts about the least surprising thing to happen from the perspective of an operator of an ingress controller, an operator of a service mesh, an end user, et cetera, et cetera. Because as we talked about it, it started feeling quickly like those people may or may not have the same thoughts about what's going to happen, in particular if you're running, say, an Istio gateway over an Istio mesh, or if you're running a Linkerd mesh with some random third-party gateway. The level of integration between those two is going to be relevant, and I think that's the big thing we're trying to figure out to make sure that we're communicating clearly in that document.
I think a big part of what I personally want to do next for this doc is try to make sure that we have explicit user stories. So instead of just having a proposal, let's make sure that we understand fully the perspective of each of the different relevant actors for these different scenarios and what their expectations might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, hope we.
And I think we're also kind of looking at some of this and going, this might end up having some ramifications with respect to policy attachment or changing routes or whatever. And so we're kind of trying to understand some of that so we can call it out for people to think about too.
Yeah, and we're touching on kind of like the big elephant in the room thing that has come up many times before of service does a lot, and disambiguating between service as a front end versus service as a collection of back end endpoints. So
yeah.
So
yay.
You may already sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm curious, have we thought about, and granted this would be like a couple of KH releases before this went into alpha, but I believe the multi-service CIDRs KEP has been merged or is very close to merging. I need to take a look at that. But that does introduce this IP address primitive within Kubernetes that could potentially be really useful here.
The last I knew, that KEP seemed to be a really, really long way away from coming close to merging. So if that seems like it's getting closer, I absolutely need to go reread it. Rob,
I think there's actually
I'm looking at you wondering if you have any information on that.
It's been a little while since I've talked to Antonio about that, but I know that's very much high priority. If it didn't get into this cycle, I'm sure it will next. But I thought it caught into this cycle, but also it's been a minute, so I'll have to confirm, get back to you. And I agree, it is very relevant for Gateway API, and I think he even added some callouts to Gateway API in the KEP itself.
Does anybody happen to know that KEP?
It's hard to find. It doesn't say IP address. It's called multiple service CIDRs. I believe it's the title of the KEP.
KEP 1880.
Okay, I should remember
KEP
that.
1880 has been merged. So let me see if I can read some about it. All right.
Yeah, I saw some code get merged. So, but beyond just the YAML saying, here's what we want to do in this cap, I saw a code PR get merged, and I believe Cal, one of the SIP network reviewers, actually reviewed it. Or is it approved? I forget the specific title. But yeah, I think there's a review and a code PR. I don't know if the code got merged yet, but it feels it's further along than the last time we talked about it, for sure. And I know we've got this, what we've kind of termed draft spec that we are 7.0. But and again, because this is a cap, it'll be alpha initially, and will probably take some time to graduate through the feature gates. But it really might be worthwhile for us to spend some time looking at this and how the IP address, like what the ideal use cases would be on the mesh side and gateway side here. So maybe that's an agenda item for next week. Do some KEP reading.
That is, I
maybe in a
think,
couple
definitely
weeks.
I think that's definitely an agenda item for next week.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I will
Thanks
make
for
a
raising that.
note to do that.
Sorry, what was that, Mike?
Oh, just thanks for raising that. I was not
Yeah,
aware if this
yeah.
had moved along and was merged.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. All right. So we will I think these are probably two separate work streams though. I think we should get some clarification from Flynn and Mike on gateways with the current draft spec. And then separately, let's start looking forward and considering, okay, how could this, GEP 1880 fit within the framework of Gateway API and Gamma specifically, once it gets out of alpha. All right. Any last questions or comments here? All
I
right.
don't think so.
Awesome. Then John, you're up next to talk about your GEP on, I believe it's called Cluster Local Gateways or something like that. John, did you make it
cool.
back?
Yeah, sorry.
There you go. Okay.
Can we open this? I assume not everyone was at the meeting yesterday. Otherwise, what I'm saying is going to be entirely redundant.
I was 100% not at the meeting yesterday.
Okay, I'll be fairly quick because it would take a while to go through all the details here. But the general idea, this is kind of vaguely gamma related. That's why I wanted to at least bring attention to it. But the idea is that in the Ingress world, we have kind of these cloud implementations and then these in-cluster implementations. And the in-cluster ones, everyone's kind of doing different things and trying to solve all these different problems, but we're doing it in different ways. So the idea here is to get some form of consistency, or at least document where we don't have consistency and get things on paper. Some of the, I forget, there was a reason that I brought this to the Gamma meeting, and I'm forgetting why it seems so relevant. I mean, there is discussion about like customizing things, which maybe could be relevant to a Gamma implementation.
Was it relevant to our provisioned versus static gateways conversation that we had a couple of meetings
Maybe,
ago?
or maybe I think it might have been really about Flynn's discussion about how you can't use like a unmanaged implementation in the conformance, but maybe that wasn't even Gamma. So maybe there's not too much to talk about here, but at least
that's the
I think
same
it's worth reading.
That's the same. Yeah.
Okay.
That
Okay,
has come up
perfect.
all over the place.
Yeah, so I don't know if we need to go more in depth here. This could just be it, unless there's any questions, but I'd encourage folks to at least take a pass through this and see if there's anything interesting to you in it.
Thank you, John.
So one of the things that I would one of the things that I keep finding when I see these pull requests that link over there, and maybe this is just me being an idiot, but getting from the pull request to the text of the GEP as rendered has never made much sense to me there. Let's see. If we want to link the rendered one, that would be very nice.
You mean the view I just had up, or the Netlify preview? Which are you wanting to link?
I think he's talking about the Netlify preview.
Yeah, but more importantly, if you go to the Netlify preview, Then so far, I ain't seen anything in that Netlify preview for enhancement proposals with GEPS 1762 in them. So what am I missing here?
Oh, you need to also update the like table of contents to add it to it there or something like that. Yeah, because that's a manual list now instead of being.
Okay, so it's not just
Yep.
me. I feel much better now.
No.
Oh, yeah. I've been forgetting about that like the last 2 times I did this too. So
Yeah. Yeah, it'll still like you can link directly to it, but it won't show up in the sidebar unless you also update that index.
All right, awesome.
And I just linked that rendered preview in the notes here. So
Excellent.
hopefully folks, yeah, it'll be easier to find it next time. All right, trudging right
And
along
also-
for our agenda.
It's also handy knowing that, oh yeah, when I could do one of these things, update the table of contents.
Yep. Okay, I don't know whose topic this is, but who wants to talk about simpler policy attachment proposal?
I can touch on it briefly, at least introduce it. It's mostly, I think, Nick's topic, who is unable to attend on this alternating week due to the time zone difference. But so Keith started an issue a couple weeks back about get feedback on policy attachment and how it is. It feels extraordinarily heavy and complex for many, particularly mesh use cases, where the like hierarchical targeting is something that is less desirable or needed in some scenarios. And it feels like a lot of like pushing meshes to implement CRD proliferation. So it's kind of like 2 different tacks on here, and I haven't had a chance to catch the recording from 2 weeks ago or something. There was a recording where Nick went into more detail on the timeouts gap draft, which I believe is one attempt of proposing something more native for some of this functionality. But then last night, Nick also introduced a simpler policy attachment proposal for a direct attachment as opposed to the like hierarchical model. So just want to kind of hopefully we're going to have some more async discussion on this and folks can get some eyes on it and we can have a more in-depth conversation next week perhaps. But just wanted to raise that work is happening to address this use case. And if this is relevant to you or something you care about, please take a look at these and feel free to weigh in with feedback.
Thank you for that, Mike. That's a really good introduction. And I know I need to go through and reread this. Sorry, Flynn, go ahead. I cut you off.
Mike, do I understand this correctly that one of the big changes here is that the direct attachment goes from the resource to the policy rather than from the policy to the resource?
No,
I don't.
We still don't have that because the concern is that there's simply too many resources that would need to change. Like there's not, for example, the service resource. If you want to attach policy to a service, or if you want to attach policy to a secret, or any resource like that, we can't add arbitrary references from all these different resources, unfortunately, or we haven't found a scalable way to do that. So instead, what's happening is still the inverse. What this really proposes is that we get rid of 2 of the other complicating factors. One of them is it's a direct reference. There's no hierarchy involved. So there's no defaults, there's no overrides. It's just, this is the policy that applies to this thing. So it is a step towards simplification, but I agree if we could find a way to do the, reverse the direction of those references, that would be amazing. Have not found a great way.
One of the things that I realized not too long ago that I hadn't been able to meaningfully articulate before is a major concern of mine with respect to policy attachment is that it will be impossible for most users to actually sit down at their terminal and use kubectl to answer what are the policies that are meaningful for this particular resource.
Yeah, so
And without doing some sort of extension for kube control or something along those lines, that feels worse than difficult. That feels actually effectively impossible for a great many users. And that actually really, really scares me about the whole policy attachment.
I absolutely completely agree with you. One of the goals in the original GEP was that by defining the structure, the standardized format, everything, that you could build that kind of UX that would show
Yeah.
you, here are all the policies that apply to my resource. It would be some kind of extension, at least initially. But the main goal is, if we can get everyone to agree on a standard, we can build that UX. If we end up with everyone diverging and creating their own way of doing things, then we can't even try. So this is really, I agree the UX isn't there, but at least if we have a path to build it, that's better than nothing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and
Well-
as everyone has said here, like, feedback is very, very welcome. We may be missing something very obvious that could simplify this further. If, open to any alternative. I think that the biggest goal we have is we want to provide standard attachment mechanisms that will be familiar and consistent, and eventually easy to understand for users, even if that does require some kind of extension. But if there's better ways to get there, I think everyone's on board with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the direct policy attachment is if for no other reason, it's good to try to prove out that approach and see if there are any issues with that, because
Yeah.
I think that's probably the base case. So I'm glad that that's potentially going to be represented in the spec. Yeah, I'll carve out some time to go through and look through this with the changes. So yeah, appreciate that. Any last comments here? All right, let's keep moving through. Flynn, backend failover and HTTP route.
This was an action item of mine from last time that we were discussing the fact that, as written, there are places where you can have a service, or sorry, you can have a route, you can add a backend ref to it and typo something, and suddenly half of your end users' traffic will get 500s. And we were kind of, I don't remember the context that this came up in originally, but the action item was, dude, you should start a GitHub discussion about this. So I started a GitHub discussion about it. The specific thing that I'm looking at here is that I 100% agree with the idea that we should try to quickly surface errors when they are made. And I also 100% disagree that we should surface them by having the end users blow up. So kind of hunting for a better way there. I also think, for the record, that this is likely to be maybe a little bit more important on the mesh side of the world than on the Ingress side of the world, but I'm not 100% convinced of that yet.
That's a really, really good point.
It also
If-
kind of ties back into things like, okay, suppose that you're a mesh. Also, you've got 4 backend refs and you know that one of them is not responding. Can we simply exclude that one from routing? Or must we continue routing to it? Yeah, those sorts of questions too.
I think those are two separate, I mean, obviously we can talk about them together, but an invalid backend and an unhealthy backend are two very different things.
I agree with that
And-
too. It just,
I feel much more uneasy about an unhealthy backend being routed to, or sorry, like
an invalid one.
an invalid one. Like I could see I mean, I see the logic for both of them really, but I'm closer to agreeing on the invalid one than the unhealthy one. If you see my comment down there, this is kind of a case I'm worried about where, we say, I really want only a small amount of traffic sent to this one service.
Mhm.
Maybe that's because it can't handle the load, or it's like highly experimental, or whatever the case, right? anything that ends up sending to super fragile in this case is suspicious, right? If it's invalid, that's one thing because it's at least very static and it's a config issue. But
Yep.
if there's a small blip in the heavy backend service, and now all of a sudden all of our traffic goes to this
Oh, yeah.
one that we said we only want one request every day to go to, that's pretty concerning to me. So I think that use case is pretty valid, but I wonder if maybe it's more of an explicit configuration.
For the record, I am 100% not trying to argue that an implementation with your case would be required to start sending 100% of the traffic to super fragile if there's a momentary blip in handle heavy load. To me, the question is more along the lines of, let's suppose that, super fragile, or let's suppose that you're doing a 50-50 split, one of them becomes unhealthy. Okay, are we allowed to just take everything back to the one that's not, or does the spec require us to continue routing to the one that we already know is unhealthy? And I did lump them together because they're kind of easy to talk about in the same, it's from the same starting point, but obviously we can certainly split those and deal with them one at a time. Rob, you were first, I think.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns we've had is just that of silent failure, right? I can imagine this scenario where you don't even realize that all your traffic is going to your canary endpoint, for example, right? Because things still are working, and it takes you days or weeks to figure out, oh, wait a second, everything's going to experimental or whatever that is. And one of the early guidelines in this API was we wanted to make it very clear when you configured something wrong to basically favor immediate feedback that you can fix and repair, as opposed to this kind of silent ongoing failure. Why is my app responding a bit slower? Why is there a higher error rate? Whatever it is, my config says I'm splitting, but actually I'm not. There may be better ways to handle that, but I just want to be very clear, like that is at least the inspiration behind this kind of guidance in the spec. I think there's probably some wiggle room, like John was saying, like maybe invalid backends can like. I admit that there are some cases where we probably want to handle them a little bit more gracefully. We just want to make sure that we're not, we're not going into that silent failure scenario.
There's a talk that I did with Daniel Bryant at KubeCon in Detroit, which is talking about resilience using the combination of an API gateway and a mesh. And one of the things that we talk about in that case, it's a demo that has a deliberately horrible application. And then you go through and use various features like, oh, we can enable retries, we can do this, we can route the traffic elsewhere, things like that. One of the questions that often turns up with that one, when we demonstrate, here's a way you can take a terrible, terrible application and then make it show up with a vaguely okay user experience. One of the questions that always ends up being, yeah, but from an operational point of view, isn't it terrible that now you've got a situation where you've made it look like it's okay, even though it's horrible? And the answer to that question is, that is not a great situation, but guess what? That's what your business processes and monitoring and alerting are supposed to cover. That's not really a technological problem. That's a process issue. And in much the same way, if we have the information available, like if it's being surfaced in a status that something is wrong, okay, I feel really bad about the idea of an invalid thing that is completely silent. I don't feel all that bad about an invalid thing that generates something that can be monitored and watched for. Keith, I think, was next.
So this is coming from some feedback from one of my teammates internally looking at the game APIs. And I want to start with just thinking about the mesh use case, specifically the mesh use case. How valuable do we feel that traffic splitting in HTTP route is for the mesh use case?
Pretty valuable, because it's the only way you can do canaries of something that's not on the edge of your cluster.
So far, correct. I think where I wanted to go with this is in a lot of mesh implementations, that there's not this distinction between traffic splitting and traffic policy, with failover policy and things of that nature. So what I'm wondering is, again, thinking specifically for the mesh use case, does it make more sense to have all traffic oriented things in a policy, including splitting and failover behavior? So I think so if you want to do something with failover, then a policy attachment would be the way to do it in the spec today. But you've also got this traffic splitting in HTTP routes. And so you've got this, okay, so policy overrides HTTP route. Sure, that I guess that makes sense, but you've got two places to look at now. So I guess I'm just wanting to ask the crazy question: does it make more sense to have traffic live in one policy resource, and instead of blowing up HTTP routes with failover configuration and things like that, would it make sense to actually abstract that? I don't know. I'm posing the question.
Yeah, I was just going to say that would kind of answer that. We had a previous point about, oh, we don't want to have to look in 10 different places to see all the policies that apply to a single resource. That would solve that problem. We were actually thinking about the same thing over here at Nginx. We started looking like, policy attachment. We had the same kind of concern. So very interested in that.
Yeah, it is definitely a tricky question. Even if you do defer some of this failover stuff to an attached policy, you still end up with questions about, okay, what does the spec allow if you didn't attach a failover policy? Right? Is the mesh required to continue going ahead and routing to the bad service? Yeah. John, I think sorry, Keith, were you done for the moment?
I think mostly I want that question to continue sitting a bit. I'll book in that part of it and then let John go by saying this. And a lot of meshes that I've seen, I think one of the reasons this gets kind of different, like funky for the mesh use case, is because for a lot of mesh implementations, you've got a resource that's not explicitly bound to service that's a lot thicker than HTTP route is. So like in Istio where you've got virtual service, with SMI, you'd have, didn't really cover failover as much, but you had HTTP route, which is more similar here. Even with OSM implementing SMI, we had a custom resource for upstream traffic setting where these other traffic-y things were defined. Forgive me, I don't remember the Linkerd or console ones here, but the rigidity of HTTP route as a beta API kind of precludes us from adding advanced load balancing configuration to that resource. So again, starting just with the mesh use case.
Yeah.
Well, theoretically, right? Beta API, not a bunch of you necessarily want to go and add stuff into there. So yeah, I want folks to continue thinking about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think like there is a difference between a backend and an endpoint. So the spec like obviously allows, and I don't see how you could not, like load balancing between endpoints within a backend. But what we're suggesting here is not just a simple weighted split between backends, but a more sophisticated load balancing across them, which I think can be really tricky. Like those backends can have different configs, for example. So you may have like one that would probably work is like, okay, different retries on handle heavy load and super fragile. That's probably fine. Like when you pick the endpoint, you apply the different retry policy. Okay. I don't think you could do that in Envoy, for example, but I can imagine that working. But if it's something like a load balancing policy, like what does it mean to have a round robin load balancer on handle heavy load and a random load balancer on super fragile or something, and maybe a least request on some third backend? Like you can't like mix these load balancing concepts like that, as far as I know. And I'm sure there's other policies that the same applies. To me, it almost feels like what you're after is not two backends with a different weight. You're after one backend that represents a composition of these two. which is something, I'm not saying it's necessarily something you want to do, but it's something you could do today, right? You could make a custom type that's like a service split or something. And then within that, that's one backend from the HTTP route perspective. You send all traffic there, and then you implement your custom semantics there. Just an idea. I don't know if that'd be a great user experience necessarily, but it would kind of represent how the API is currently modeled, but still meet your use case without bending any rules or anything, I would think.
In a lot of ways, I haven't even started looking at this from the perspective of an implementer. I'm looking at it almost entirely from the perspective of somebody who is trying to use the HTTP route and thinking about what they expect when they configure certain things. If you configure a 50-50 split, but if you have something that's already working and then you typo a new thing being added and then half of it stops working, that feels like it would surprise almost everybody using these things right now. That's the invalid case I was talking about beforehand.
I'm not sure it's that surprising. I mean, if you change a service and you make the port number wrong, right, your traffic is going to fail. Like, is there any implementation that does this like typo correction today? And it could be a novel thing that we're going to do better than any other implementations. But I am curious if anyone's doing something like this.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think one of the concerns, just to go back to that a little bit, is if we have some kind of auto fix capability, right? You know, we knew the previous state was good and we're going to stick with that. And then for some reason, our controller restarts, loses state, something happens, and then it breaks, you know, a week from when the config change happens over the weekend or something, then you've created a worse problem than, you know, it broke the second I changed this, so I need to roll back this specific change.
There are things in Emissary that no, Keith, let's not run ChatGPT as a Kubernetes operator. That's a terrifying idea. Yeah, there are things in Emissary where if we notice that you've put in an invalid resource, the invalid resource will be rejected, just, you know, completely rejected. And so that does have the effect, the way Emissary's API language works, that has the effect that if you in fact try to do an invalid, the equivalent of an invalid backend, there are a lot of situations where Emissary will simply ignore your invalid backend and use the other ones. Generally speaking, we've found that to be a reasonable thing based on customer feedback. There's also the situation in Emissary where it is possible in some situations for it to generate an invalid Envoy config, figure out it's invalid, not use it, and then a week later something restarts and it doesn't have the good one anymore. And so we've seen that case too. And that is a much worse situation that I would love to avoid. But arranging it so that the end user, like the end user of the application, always has to bear the brunt of operator mistakes concerns me. And I would like us to do better than that.
One point I would also like to make is, I don't know if we have, as a community, decided what this API is, right?
Mhm.
Is this the common language that all implementers use that is in the building blocks for higher level APIs, or is this the high level API, right? Like Kubernetes to some extent has decided that it's the building blocks, right? You can, and people often do use service and deployment and whatnot directly, but it's kind of meant as a foundation for a platform on top of it. Like, are we that super, super high level API, or are we somewhere lower?
Multiple implementations currently allow you to create a gateway and receive a gateway. So maybe we're somewhere in between, but we certainly aren't just a backend.
No.
Yeah, I think I really like John's distinction earlier about service health versus endpoint health. I understand the use case of trying to help the user. I think in light of the distinction between service health and endpoint health, my gut tells me to pivot back to that gateway API that gateway API idea of failing fast and failing loudly, and not doing things in secret. If an endpoint's healthy, or an endpoint is no longer healthy, you probably want to transparently route around that. And basically that's how Kubernetes does it. Like if a pod isn't ready, Kubernetes won't send traffic to it. I kind of feel like the same principle applies here, to where, okay, if an endpoint in your service is not healthy, then sure, your mesh implementation or gateway implementation shouldn't route there. And Kubernetes actually will help you not route there, for obvious failures based on your health checks. But if you've got other mesh specific health checks you want to do, then yeah, you can do that as well. If your service is unhealthy though, then you probably want that to be, that means all endpoints are down. And if all endpoints are down, that points to, okay, you've got a cloud provider outage of some sort in your AZ, or you sent some bad config somewhere, or, I'm trying to think, okay, what are the scenarios that would cause every endpoint for a service to go down? And is there a scenario where we'd actually want to protect the user from that by transparently sending traffic somewhere else? And I struggle to think of a scenario like that. Maybe you have one, but I personally can't really think of that scenario.
Yeah, my main thing on the unhealthy question is, I think it would be a good thing to write down what the spec, what gateway requires and what the expectations are. Because I didn't actually see anything about that in the spec when I was looking around with this stuff. The invalid one is a little bit more. The invalid one is the one where I feel more like we ought to change what it says, but for the unhealthy one, I think at minimum we should probably write down what is expected and write down what is believed.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that I think there is, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there is a section in the spec about the expected behavior for.
There's a section about the expected behavior for invalid, but I didn't see anything about unhealthy.
Yeah, I think we have something somewhere, but it's definitely not clear. It may just be in my head and nowhere else. So who knows? Definitely
Well,
worth
in that case, we
worth a
should
follow up.
in that case, we should just write down that clearly the right answer here is, to understand this, you have to go ask Rob, and then that'll be grip on, right, Rob?
Perfect.
Yeah. But the funny thing, of course, is that the real reason I put that in there was just that I had the action item and figured I would say, hey, this is done now. So we should probably move on to other things and continue this asynchronously. But thanks for the very interesting discussion, everybody. I appreciate that.
Yeah, good points from everyone. I think
Yep.
I think we don't have any specific action items to follow up, but rather just join the discussion and let this sink in for a while.
Yep, I agree.
Sounds good. All right, Rob, you've got the last two topics and about 7 minutes to go through them. Want to start with contributor ladder?
Yeah, I think plenty of time for both of these. Contributor ladder is a doc that I talked about yesterday as well at the main meeting. I just wanted to highlight it here because there's not a complete overlap in people. We really appreciate everyone who's been already actively helping. To review, commit, lots of new conformance tests, lots of great reviews out there. And we want to recognize that with additional roles in the community. So if you've been involved and you're looking to formalize that role in some way or fashion, we have tons of opportunities. We are about to have 3 different projects under Gateway API, obviously Gateway API itself, and then Ingress to Gateway, and soon to be Bleaked once that transition completes. We want to be very clear that everyone is welcome to, get involved. You don't have to have a formal role, but you're very welcome to work towards one. And some guidelines there. The contributor ladder I've proposed below is very similar to what exists in upstream Kubernetes. There's the organization member. We've already helped many people get to organization member. Thanks for all the great contributions that helped to get to that point. Then reviewer is really kind of that first line, the first people that are reviewing all the PRs, and all these cases you can specialize in a few different areas, whether that's conformance, documentation, gaps. There are other areas within our code base too. You could work on Bleakst or ingress to gateway or something else entirely, but we're really trying to find ways for people to get involved as much as possible and to formalize the contributions that have already been made. There's people that already, I think, qualify for many of these roles. So if this is something that interests you, just reach out to any one of the maintainers or leads on this project, and we'll try and help get you set up. But this is kind of a combined thank you to everyone who's already been doing so much, and also, if you want to be recognized with a formal role, we'd love to have you. So just yeah, and also on that note, don't hesitate to add comments, questions, whatever. This is just a proposal. We can change things. Yeah, that's all for this one. Cool.
Awesome.
And
Thanks, Rob.
cool. And the next one is really short, but because this is the morning meeting, at least in Pacific time, we are trying out a main Gateway API meeting also around this time. So if you happen to be in Europe or on the East Coast and want to go to the main Gateway API meeting, that's Monday at 9 a.m. Pacific. We're testing out this time because we've heard that there are some people that would love to come but haven't been able to make it because it's too late in the day. Yeah, so please, this is kind of our test run to see if people will actually show up. We've heard that there's interest, but if there is, please try and make it so we can clearly understand that there's interest there and it's worth rotating back and forth or whatever it ends up being. Yeah,
Was
that's
that
all.
updated on the calendar as well?
It is, yeah.
Okay,
And
thank you.
I think Shane just sent out a mailing list to Signet as well. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks.
If nobody shows up to next week's, it's not the last time we'll ever try it though. So if you can't make it, try to make it, but.
I'll
I-
be there.
I actually missed an important detail in all of this. During this meeting, we were talking about Antonio's KEP, and Antonio's based in EU. So I asked if he could show up to the next meeting to talk about his KEP. He will be there. So if you're interested in learning more about all that stuff, he'll be there to answer any questions and give a high-level overview of it. So, yeah.
You should have led with that. Oh, that is a headline event there.
Right.
I was already going to be there, but now I'm certainly going to make sure I've got time for that. I'm really excited for that. That's awesome.
Great. Cool.
All right, fantastic. Thank you everybody again for showing up and for having these great discussions. A reminder, the next Gateway API meeting next week, like Rob just said, will be at 9 a.m. Pacific on Monday. The next Gamma meeting will be at 3 p.m. Pacific that next Tuesday. Take care, everybody, and I'll talk to you all later.